We're on to our final speaker today, Danil Zburivsky, Director of Big Data and Data Science at Pythian.
All right. Thank you, Stephen. First of all, thanks everyone for joining our webinar today. And what I decided to talk about today is a slightly different topic from what Hayes and Rainer were describing in their presentations. I thought it would be interesting to give kind of notes from the field type of a presentation where I will speak about what we see, what Python sees with their customers in terms of big data ecosystem, how different companies approach different problems. And the reason I think that these stories would be interesting is because we as a company have about 20 years of experience dealing with all types of data platforms, and we have about 400 people across the world dealing with the most challenging customer problems. And obviously, we see some things that may be outside of the scope what you would normally deal with if you're focused on a certain vertical or a certain kind of a specific solution that your company sells. So this kind of breadth of expertise that we have and a breadth of environments that we get exposed to, I think makes some of the stories that we see quite interesting. So I combined some of the things that we see in the field and prepared this kind of presentation overview about how people approach harnessing the big data ecosystem these days and what are the challenges that we see. Believe me or not, but we still get questions from our prospects and customers about whether Hadoop is a mature technology. I think Rainer mentioned that Hadoop is like 10 years old now as the tech, but still is being bucketed into this not quite enterprise-ready solution, if you like. And there is some background to this question, right? Really, what we see is that Hadoop definitely evolved over the 10 years. And yes, when it first was adopted by the early adopters, there were certain enterprise features that were lacking. And I guess that's what made people question whether Hadoop is actually that mature and whether it can be used in an enterprise environment. But we see the trend shifting, right? So there's a lot of vendors out there in terms of both Hadoop distributions and supporting software and frameworks that are helping Hadoop to move into the enterprise ecosystem more seamlessly. And we definitely see big banks adopting Hadoop. And there are Rohit and Rainer mentioned big telcos and companies like that adopting those ecosystems. So it's definitely from adoption perspective, we see that industry starts to recognize that Hadoop is mature enough for the use case that it's trying to fulfill. And I mean, in our experience, when we started serving our big data customers about 6 years ago, what every single company that we talked to was talking about is they were just talking about how Hadoop can help them potentially, or they wanted us to tell them how Hadoop would solve their business problem. And over the years, this shifted to actually let's implement it, or even more often, we already have a Hadoop system. Can you come in and make it better, make it faster, make it more secure, or just help us with implementing new use cases? So we definitely see this trend where people kind of stop talking about Hadoop as a theoretical kind of idea, but actually have the real implementations in their enterprises. There's still some gaps in terms of market penetration from our perspective. And what we see is that some companies taking this leap and they are bypassing Hadoop and moving into the cloud-based big data environments directly. And we will talk more about this during my presentation, but I think that's an interesting observation to make. And another sign of kind of adoption and maturity is that we see people asking us to migrate off Hadoop for different reasons. But when we started the big data practice, we didn't get those requests. We're just seeing them now, which means the adoption of the technology is definitely growing. So that's a natural life cycle. So really, what makes Hadoop kind of stand out, and why those questions like why on the other end of spectrum we see that companies still question whether Hadoop is mature technology, and others are already considering better alternatives or improving existing setups, like what makes Hadoop as a technology kind of stand out? And I think it's not news to anyone, is that Hadoop is actually many things, right? It's not an enterprise like monolithic software that you purchase and you install your system and you use it. It's really a combination of multiple open source, in most cases, projects that have been integrated together to achieve certain results. And really, the level of integration that we see it has varying level of, those things have been integrated with varying level of success. Some things work together very well, especially the core Hadoop ecosystem projects. Things that get introduced into the Hadoop ecosystem at later stages, they might not play as well with other products. And with a growing number of ecosystem projects, it's harder and harder to manage. And that's where the Hadoop vendors step in, and Hadoop distribution vendors specifically. And what they offer companies is this bundled solution where everything is included, and you should not worry about this integration. And they're doing a great job, and obviously improving the innovation in Hadoop space and making those integrations more seamless. But it's still there are still some issues that exist. One thing that we see is that if you're choosing a Hadoop distribution or you're considering either upgrade or migration, you should be aware that every single distribution brings its own flavor. You will, if you choose to go with one vendor, you will kind of have to embrace their philosophy of doing things, their selection of Hadoop packages. So you may see whether you need to make a trade-off between Impala and Hive on Taz to run your SQL queries on Hadoop, things like that. And there are some little items that you will need to be aware when you're making this decision, because it will influence your final architecture. It will influence the skill set of the people that you will need to hire to develop on this platform and support it in the future. But another interesting trend is that some of the ecosystem projects, and in our experience, we're looking specifically at Spark and Kafka, they are becoming as big as Hadoop itself in terms of importance and in terms of adoption by the enterprises and in terms of requirements for support. It's pretty common to put Kafka in the Hadoop ecosystem project, but really it's a standalone kind of distributed message bus system that can be used without Hadoop, and is being used without Hadoop in many successful use cases. It provides Hadoop integration, but it really it has quickly outgrown this environment and is being used not just for the kind of ingestion, improving ingestion into the Hadoop, but also becomes their application exchange message bus, where applications just exchange data through Kafka, and it doesn't really have to integrate with Hadoop itself. Spark is another interesting case of a project which was initially introduced as the next iteration over the MapReduce framework, but really now you see clusters that are just pure Spark clusters. They don't have anything except Spark and maybe HDFS, and sometimes even they don't use HDFS as a storage. And it's a successful computational intensive cluster that some companies use to deploy, but really there is not much left out of the original Hadoop ecosystem in this type of environment. So those projects definitely become bigger than the original ecosystem, and it's important to be aware of that when you are choosing the architecture and the environment that you will use a big data platform in. So this leads to a question and observation that, again, the philosophy that Hadoop vendor distribution follow is that they are the one-stop shop for all your Hadoop or all your big data needs. And we think it's probably an illusion because, as I said, Spark and Kafka are already good examples of projects that, while being supported by existing vendors, they may be, first of all, used completely separately, or provide there are vendors out there that may provide better support for this specific part of the ecosystem than what you get from the bundled Hadoop distribution. And we've seen cases in the past with our existing customers where the customer preferred to choose this specific Kafka distribution, but a different vendor for Hadoop distribution because they wanted to have this mix and match of features that the Hadoop vendor didn't provide to them. Even when choosing a Hadoop distribution, I guess my main point is that you should be ready to integrate multiple solutions. You should be ready to adopt technologies outside what your vendor provides, and you should kind of keep an open mind about what exists out there to make your specific environment successful and more dynamic and more robust. Another interesting trend that we see is Hadoop and the cloud. Everyone talks about the cloud. That's one of the fastest growing kind of practices for Pythian as well these days. So the natural question is, should we migrate our Hadoop to the cloud if we're on-premise, if the customer has an on-premise setup? Should we build a new ecosystem with Hadoop in the cloud? And that's the kind of questions we get from the customers all the time. What my opinion is that Hadoop as the core technology might be not the ideal fit into the cloud environment. And the reason is Hadoop provides great scalability properties for on-premise setups, but it's still not, it was built for data centers originally. And in the cloud, it looks like it almost can't keep up with the kind of elasticity and speed of resource provisioning that the cloud provides. So essentially, we believe that cloud provides more flexibility than existing Hadoop ecosystem supports. And don't get me wrong, it's possible to run Hadoop in the cloud, and we have done a number of successful implementations like that. But what we see is that maintaining a large permanent cluster in the cloud is very expensive, especially if you are talking about scale of like terabytes and petabytes data size. And there are some better alternatives in the cloud that exist. There are some good distributed SQL engines like Amazon Redshift or Google BigQuery or Azure SQL Warehouse that might be better alternatives to run your SQL workloads than any existing Hadoop environments provide. And again, Spark and Kafka seem to adopt the cloud more seamlessly. So that's why you see the managed services from cloud providers like Google PubSub or Amazon Kinesis or Azure Event Data Hub that use the same paradigm, or even sometimes use Kafka as the backend to provide the scalable message bus systems. So one of the examples is a project where Python provided a migration, like a support to migrate a large on-premise Hadoop cluster with petabytes of data for big messaging kind of instant messaging companies and into the Google Cloud. And guess how much of our original Hadoop architecture was left once the migration to the cloud was completed? Well, there was not much left. There were some basic Spark jobs that we could run on the Elastic clusters in the cloud, but there was no need to maintain this permanent cluster all the time. So when looking into the cloud migrations for the Hadoop platforms or building new big data platforms in the cloud, I think it's really important to understand that there might be different alternatives. Some of the Hadoop ecosystem projects are easily reusable, especially like Spark and Kafka and some others in the cloud. But for things like permanent HDFS, you might be looking into cloud storage solutions and other alternatives for SQL engines and things like that. So your architecture will change significantly when you think and you shift from on-premise to the cloud, and Hadoop is not an exception. You have to be ready to accept that. Security was covered today by Rohit and Rainer, which was great presentations. And it's really the big topic in any environment right now is the security and governance on the data. There's more and more regulations that the companies need to stay compliant with, and there's more and more demand to provide this robust analytic environment, but still provide security. In our experience, it's still a challenge with Hadoop ecosystems. There are great products like Kafka and encryption products that Rainer was describing that help solve some of those problems. But we feel there's still no universal solution. There's still no universal answer of how security beyond Kerberos should be implemented in Hadoop. And once you go outside of the core Hadoop ecosystem into the third party, you are immediately limited in some way by what you can and what you can do. For example, if you want to integrate, the product might integrate with AWS right now for key management, but it doesn't support Azure or GCP, and that's your preferred cloud of choice. So there's some flexibility that you'll be losing when moving in that direction. And when it comes to ephemeral clusters in the cloud, the governance and security are even more challenging problems, which like there's no off-the-shelf product that probably will resolve them for you. So real quick, how to survive in this world. So there's a lot of complexity, there's a lot of change. Some people are just adopting the big data ecosystem, some of them already migrating to the cloud. So in our experience, it's really important to have a solid foundation by following or helping somebody helping you to follow a blueprint architectures. It's really easy to get the architecture wrong if it involves 50 different sub-projects that needs to be integrated. You need to be ready to integrate multiple products. So it's true for the both proprietary and open source. You need to understand that Hadoop is the kind of multiple projects stitched together. And you always have to be on the lookout of what's new, look what beyond what your Hadoop vendor provides right now, because there might be better alternatives and there might be better ways to achieve the results that you might want. With that, that's all I had for today's presentation. If you have any questions, there are some contact information where you can reach me if you would like to follow up on this discussion.
Danil, our next question is for you. Kafka is included in both Cloudera and Hortonworks Hadoop distributions. Why do you think additional support for Kafka is required beyond what the vendors provide?
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's a good question. It's actually a relatively new trend that we see. As I said, Kafka is becoming more and more feature full, so it has more and more features that enterprise want. And what we discovered is that very often for a Hadoop vendor, it's really hard to keep up with the upstream changes from the either open source community or the vendors that only maintain Kafka as their core product. So really what's driving people to look outside of the, let's say, big three Hadoop vendor support for Kafka is the fact that some features just take too long to propagate into those distributions. And those features that enterprise wanted, especially around disaster recovery and security, might already exist in a different Kafka version that's provided and supported by a different vendor. So companies take this risk. They say, we would like rather to work with multiple vendors, but get the features we want, except just to stick to one prescribed way of doing things.
Danil, our next question is for you. Are there any alternatives to Hadoop in the cloud?
Yes. So the answer to that probably would depend on the use case that you're trying to achieve. In our experience, I guess the most common alternative for the use cases where you don't require a permanent cluster to be available 24/7 is to use some kind of elastic let's say Spark execution engine, whether it's a Dataproc from Google or it's Elastic MapReduce from Amazon, to run your transformation jobs. Use the storage provided by cloud, either blob storage or S3, instead of HDFS, and rely on one of the cloud-specific scalable data warehouses like Amazon Redshift or Google BigQuery or Azure Cloud Data Warehouse for your SQL engine. So combining those services together, you are not really using a full-scale Hadoop ecosystem, but you're still achieving the same results, and you can even move to close to real time with some additional changes to that architecture, but it eliminates the need of maintaining the large permanent cluster. So that is one of the most common alternatives that we see these days.
Danil, what are your final thoughts, for the attendees on today that are just beginning their journey to harnessing the Hadoop ecosystem? What are some of the key things they should keep in mind? And as an add-on question, how would you compare performance of Hadoop on-premises versus the cloud?
Okay, so I'll quickly answer the performance question. So essentially, if you compare the performance from like VM to VM perspective or like machine to machine perspective, for the clusters of the same size and same configuration. The reality is the cloud providers made significant advances in performances and types of the nodes that they provide. So you can probably achieve a similar performances or maybe slightly less than you would achieve on the bare metal. But the reality is there is more to the cloud economics than just performance, and you might consider some of the alternative architectures that would save you either on the cost of the total hardware that you require, or can provide some of the unique scalability features for the SQL engines that you can't even achieve on the Hadoop ecosystem. So I guess the summary for that is you can achieve similar performances, but there are probably better way from economics and management perspective of do things in the cloud that you would do on the premise. And as for the final remarks, I guess what I'd like to say is that embrace the change. That's kind of the main message that I was trying to relay with my presentation today, is that if you are entering the big data analytics space or trying to adopt some of those technologies, be ready to adopt different technologies, stay on the lookout for better ways to do it, review your stack and your architectures often, because this world moves very fast, and you need to make sure that you are still achieving the results with the best tools that are out there.